starting out. I think it's wise that they start a little bit later on the final one.
Yes, indeed. I was thinking that. Here we go.
They've got you, Mike.
Now I'm on the hot seat. Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to go grab some. Is that okay? Need something writing. I want to get a legal pad. Is that okay? A pad.
Everyone took your cue.
So it seems. I'm still.
Are we all?
I know it broke to corner. No, it's the one that I left something I wish to take. I apologize.
You can always turn your mic off.
Matter. No, I just don't like the idea of not being able to take notes. Yeah, that'll be just fine. Thank you. And you thought the false alarm was your only worry.
I started running the time already. We lost. Okay. Can I go?
Well, my watch says it's 9:12. I've checked.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are 1 minute early, but the clock in front of me has already started ticking, so we lost 1 minute already. So I thought that we could get started with this plenary panel on inequality in China, India, and America. Actually, I expect that our distinguished panel speakers will be looking more broadly at the issues. And we do have an outstanding panel: Steve Durlauf from the University of Wisconsin, Xiao Geng from Fung Global Institute, John McArthur also from Fung Global Institute, and Sanjay Reddy from the New School of Social Research. I'm Carlo Padoan from the OECD. Let me kick off with, if I may, with a few remarks. It's often been said that the financial crisis started as a financial crisis. It eventually turned into an economic crisis, and it ended up being a social crisis. And I think I would share that view, which means that the issues of inequality are very much part and parcel of the way we look at crisis. But this does not mean that inequality was not an issue before that. Actually, there is broad evidence that inequality has been on the rise before. And as you know, there's been many suggesting that rising inequality can be seen as one of the causes of the financial crisis, as the financial response, or the one provided by financial markets to inequality, eventually produced very bad consequences and results. So this, to me, introduces two challenges to all of us who are interested in analysis, but also to all of us like myself are interested in the policy implications of what we see. First of all, we need to understand what are the causes of inequality and how they generate new consequences. But then what are the policy implications of that? How is the policy picture changing? Well, it's changing in a number of ways, and I expect the panelists and the floor to take that up later on. First of all, of course, the obvious policy response to inequality would be, what can policy do to address inequality? Are there specific instruments that can address that? Yes, there are, and are they still effective? But I think that there are further questions, and at least at the OECD we've been looking a lot at those issues in further developing the point. One point is that there may be unintended consequences for inequality coming out of policy instruments and strategies that are being developed for other purposes. For instance, we are now looking in depth at the inequality consequences of growth policies. OECD has been looking into growth policies, be they labor market, product market, innovation, tax policy, looking at the impact on per capita growth. But then we're looking at what this implies for inequality, and it's not always obvious what comes out. So the first question is, when we suggest a policy, when we propose policy advice to governments and others, we should be warning them that yes, they might get more growth, but they might also be getting more inequality, and so the issue of trade-offs arises. Secondly, however, and more and in a deeper sense, is looking at inequality not as a second step in the policy discourse, but looking at inclusive growth from the beginning. And this is what we are now looking at more deeply at the OECD. We think that looking at growth alone is not something that we can think of as we hopefully finally get out of the global crisis. And certainly we cannot go back to business as usual. So we need to rethink the policy strategy in a multidimensional perspective, where growth is not a mean to itself, it's an end, and issues like sustainability, environmental sustainability, inequality are very much there from the beginning in terms of both inclusive opportunities, equality of opportunities as well as outcomes. Of course, and this is my final point, this has general aspects. We can draw general lessons, but we can also draw very country-specific lessons, as of course no one size fits all. And this, at least from my point of view, is the policy challenge. How can we use general experiences and evidence and comparative evidence to draw for each country, given the institutional settings, useful policy recommendations. But I've spoken enough already. My distinguished colleagues will develop, I guess, both the analysis and I imagine policy implications, looking at specific country experiences, but also more broadly. And then we will have time for Q&A from you. So I tried hard to think of a speaking order which goes beyond alphabetical. I could not succeed. So I'll ask Steve Durlauf to take the floor.
Well, thank you for coming and for the opportunity to speak. What I'm going to do in this presentation is give a very brief overview of intergenerational mobility in the United States, which takes the big picture that was articulated and is going to concentrate it into a relatively specific question, but nevertheless one that is extraordinarily complicated, if not, in the jargon of some of the sessions here, complex. Further, I also am going to engage in some shameless self-promotion in the sense, not me personally, but for the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Group, which INET has generously sponsored, to indicate how we are trying to tackle this question in ways that hopefully do reflect the desire to break disciplinary and intellectual barriers. And so to start this off, I actually wanted to begin with a quotation from Abraham Lincoln from the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which he said that there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I hold that he is entitled to these as the white man. I agree with Judge Douglas that he is not my equal in many respects, certainly not in color, perhaps not in intellectual and moral endowments, but in the right to eat the bread of his own hands without leave of anyone else, which his own hand earns. He is my equal and the equal of Judge Douglas and the equal of every other man. Now, why would I want to start with that quotation? One reason, of course, is to the extent that the United States has a secular saint, it is Lincoln, and he articulates an ethical position that I think underlies much of the inequality research. And so this is how I'd like to sort of think about linking the HCEO group with his lofty quotation. And the first point is that there are two fundamental ethical principles in Lincoln's speech, which I think you see in the way that we are trying to address questions. The first is a notion of moral equality of individuals, and the second is some notion that relates rewards to merit. In other words, that self-realization is also a virtue that a society ought to address, and one of the tensions that exists in egalitarian policies will always involve trade-offs there. The second thing, of course, is to recognize that I'm taking a quotation from somebody who was born into a staggeringly racially and prejudiced environment in the late 1850s, and there's ethical limitations. And these, again, are part of what HCEO, in a very indirect way, is trying to address. And what I mean by that is that if one starts with these deep principles of Lincoln's, it begs the question as to what it means to respect the moral equality of individuals. In other words, it's one thing to say that legal restrictions on earning one's bread are taken away, but the upshot of all research in the 20th century in inequality says that far more is necessary to make it meaningful to say that somebody has the same right as Judge Douglas or anybody else to prosper. And that's part of what this network is trying to do, is to understand what it means to truly create equality of opportunity. And that is obviously a very difficult question. And a second comment, of course, is that the work that we're doing also calls into question how we think about merit. And I'll talk about that a bit at the end in terms of policy. And again, if I wanted to sort of come full circle in terms of the 21st century vision of what social justice entails, it's going to have to do with issues of focusing on opportunities as opposed to outcomes to a substantial extent. And it's going to focus on a broad conception of human flourishing, and that's what Sen's capability approach in a very crude way can be understood. So let me give you an example of the sort of question this network wants to address, and that is, there was a New York Times article last week about a recent study published that's going to be published in the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity that identified that there were literally hundreds of thousands of poor adolescents who have high test scores would qualify and be certain to be admitted to very selective institutions, and yet aren't attending them. They aren't even applying to them. And so how ought one to think about that? Do we simply write it off and say, people have preferences? I assure you that everyone in this room who's had teenage children knows that there's heterogeneity and degrees of ambition, etc. But obviously that's an inadequate point. We reject that view in this network, and we want to understand why decisions like that are being made. And after all, in terms of talking about the complex matrix of factors that generates persistence of socioeconomic status, hence immobility in the United States, these are the sorts of phenomena that have to be understood, the causal mechanisms addressed and identified, and from that, efficacious policies pursued, or at least considered. Now, one comment I did want to make that possibly differentiates, not in spirit, but in orientation of the HCEO from some of the other endeavors, is that it is very much a data-driven and empirical activity. In other words, we've heard quite a bit about the defects of economic theory, which matter for the way that we are formulating phenomena ranging from teenage decision-making, which was probably a good prima facie case against rationality, to broader questions about how you think about how to make decisions in environments with ambiguity and the like. But our goal really is to create a tight nexus between theory, statistical analysis, and empirical conclusions, and in that way to generate what we hope is policy-relevant research, and research that can address this staggeringly persistent and complex phenomenon. So, as I said, in terms of the HCEO network, the way that we are trying to think about intergenerational mobility is along three dimensions. The first is simply measurement. If I say to you that I wish to pursue or generate something called equality of opportunity, I have to define that object. In other words, it has a prima facie ethical appeal, but at the end of the day, how do we sensibly talk about that as a feature that is either present or lacking in the United States? The second aspect of our work is really about mechanisms. In other words, if we're going to try to make policy evaluation at the end of the day, we can't just have a set of normative criteria, we also have to have a positive theory of the generation of inequality. One thinks differently about a world in which racial segregation and discrimination are generating black-white income differences from a world in which the difference between myself and a sibling is that one of us likes to gamble and the other one doesn't. And so mechanisms are absolutely at the core of any normative considerations. And so there isn't going to be a dichotomy between the two. And the third point is that much of this work of the network, of course, is on policy evaluation. And what that means is not only considering conventional ways of trying to enhance mobility in American society, but also push the boundaries on the policies that are under consideration. So in terms of measurements, so this is a really easy to read slide. The first comment I want to make is that there's that evidence has mounted that is universally accepted that the degree of immobility in the United States is substantially higher than has been previously understood. The standard statistic for measuring mobility is to look at the correlation between father and son incomes or wages. And in the 1970s, that number was often regarded as having the value of 0.2. And if you think about that, that led to the famous phrase, shirt sleeves in 3 generations, because if I cube that number, I get something very small. In contrast, as better data have become available, and there's been deeper thinking about what it is that we want to think about in the transmission of economic status across generations, not just my income at the age 25, but rather the life stream of income. The best estimates are suggestive of numbers on the order of magnitude of 0.6. And of course, if you cube that, there's a big difference between 2.216 and 0.008. And so on the table, I want to simply place substantial evidence of much more persistence than had been understood. There's also some evidence that that degree of persistence, as I've articulated, has been increasing since the 1980s. From the perspective of HCO, however, this is an inadequacy of the empirical literature. And what I mean by that is that the focus on numbers, such as what's the correlation between parents and children, does not reflect the richness of what we mean by social and economic mobility. For example, the very exercise of doing calculations of this form does not allow for the possibility of a poverty trap. Similarly, it doesn't allow for the possibility of what I'll call an affluence trap. In other words, it presupposes that the transmission mechanism for the very poor is exactly the same as for the very affluent. And one aspect of the work of the initiative is the development of better ways to conceptualize the literal measurement of what social mobility means, and to do it in a way that segues more carefully with the relevant philosophical literature on thinking about social justice, or in particular distributive justice. In addition to that, and this is where the issue of mechanisms comes into play, if we start off with an objective of equalizing inequalities of opportunity, the fact that there's a high correlation between parents and children doesn't tell us whether or not opportunities are unequal or not. In other words, without a specification of the mechanisms, one cannot make the move from here's a set of observations about intergenerational mobility to here are appropriate policies. And notice that's true both normatively as well as positively. Without the understanding of the mechanisms, one can't really assess which policies will be most effective. All right, and so in terms of mechanisms, I knew I was going to mess this one up. In mechanisms, I think that that's maybe a way to understand what the to understand one dimension of the HCO agenda. And what I mean by that, of course, is that HCO is covering many different aspects of inequality. And what I'm focusing on is one aspect of it, and I've narrowed it to the United States. And so I'm not going to talk about our ongoing efforts to study inequality in China and their nascent efforts to study inequality in India, but I'm just going to focus on the American case and indicate how the different networks that comprise the overall HCEO are contributing to understanding these phenomena. So I think the most productive network, I wish I could say I was the head of it, but I'm not, but it is the most productive, is the Early Childhood Interventions Group, which is focused on how cognitive and non-cognitive, aka personality traits, evolve across the development of through adolescence and have long-run effects on adult socioeconomic outcomes. there is remarkable evidence that Jim Heckman has developed that the rate of return on intense early childhood investments actually beats the stock market. It's on the level of 6 to 10%. So if you think about it from a social perspective, these are self-financing policies. But the upshot is that what the early childhood investments group has been able to is doing is it's focusing on the transmission mechanism of socioeconomic status from the perspective of the entire adolescent development curve. And it is emphasizing that the bang per buck, as it were, is particularly high for young children. And that's not surprising, given what's known in neuroscience about the plasticity of the brain, and an aspect of the network is trying to actually bring ideas from neuroscience into the socioeconomic analysis. A second aspect of this network, which has important connections, the first is the identity and personality network, which is actually our effort to embody ideas from behavioral economics and more generally simply from psychology into understanding the decision-making of individuals, be they parents, be they teenagers, be they employers. And what this network really is focusing on is personality as a distinct attribute of the set of skills used very broadly, liberally defined, that determines socioeconomic success or failure as an adult. A third component of this, of our project is the Family Inequality Network, which is again focusing on the implications of family structure for investments in children, which of course aren't just money, but have to do with time, intensity of care, and the like. And there, obviously, important issues having to do with the evolving nature of the American family come into play. The fact that 30% of American children today live in single-parent households says something about the nature of the investments, if for no other reason, that there simply isn't the amount of time that the caregivers have available to them is going to be smaller. Each of these, in a different way, is both pushing, I will immodestly say, economic theory, but it's trying to do it in this principled, data-driven fashion. A second dimension of the network is, of the initiative does the following, and that is it's focusing both on enhancing the, making the segue from individual development into market outcomes, as well as broadening the domain of what we think about as inequality. And so the Markets Network is actually focusing on human capital acquisition and its associated returns. In other words, that's economist jargon for saying the associated questions there are, number one, how do financial markets facilitate the acquisition of human capital? Are there credit constraints keeping people from going to college, for example, or engaging in other types of investment? And second, how do labor markets price these different, one more minute, is that okay? Okay, price these different phenomena. What the health network does is it expands another dimension of understanding inequality. In other words, it treats health itself as one of the factors that determine socioeconomic success and failure, and through that gives you a richer conception of what it is early childhood deprivation can do in terms of adolescent consequences. So the final group, and this is where I'll end, is what is the Inequality Measurement and Policy Network, which is, I called it the most eclectic, which is maybe is a euphemism for something less flattering. But what it is doing is trying to broaden the notion, the understanding of individual decision-making and outcomes from the sociological perspective. And so this is where you have a relationship between the Oxford network that's working on social networks, for example, just as the Identity and Personality Network has deep links to everything that was discussed yesterday about ambiguity and the limits to rationality. And so in this network, what one has is an effort both to expand the sociological conception of individual decision-making and complement to the psychological decision-making, but then come full circle to the questions of how does one measure policy evaluation and how does one make normative conclusions. And so let me just end by saying, remarkably, there's actually links between this work and what is called virtue ethics, which is itself of great interest because it represents a confluence of Aristotelian and Confucian perspectives on what the good life is. So let me stop there, and I apologize for going over time. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve, and also thanks for putting on the table this measurement mechanism and policy approach, which is, I think, is very general. Xiao, you have the floor. You want to?
Yeah.
stay there, or you need no?
I can just sit here.
Okay.
Well, I will talk about China, how China actually come to today from 30 years ago. 30 years ago, China had equality. My parents, they have 36 yuan a month, no change for 10 years. Yeah. So everyone at that time are equal. So today, a lot of inequality, but my point is that when Deng Xiaoping started reform, his slogan is that a few people get rich first. So that process has gone to today and created 4 areas of inequality. It's the inequality between rural and urban, the inequality between the East and the West, and the inequality between the depositor and the borrower. I would discuss a little bit more later. This is related to finance. And then the inequality between the state-owned company and the private company. I would go through how it emerged, and then how the government has been trying to deal with it. Let me start with the rural and urban, which is extremely complicated. But the history is like this. When China opened up, the first thing China do is to export, basically plugging China into the global supply chain. So a lot of village, farmers, they moved to East Coast, become migrant workers. That started, I think, probably the most important policy in terms of equality. It's basically the mobility for the peasants. There was an incident happened about 15 years ago in Guangdong. There was a person, the security guard the police basically think he was a migrant worker, and then basically beat him to death. And it turns out that he was a college student. And that incident leads to a very strong reaction from all over China, and including the Chinese government. And then basically State Council issued a directive saying that in the future, no police can send any peasants home. Because the practice before was that basically that peasants, they have household registration in the rural area, so they are not belonging to the cities. So police can send them back. After that incident, basically the mobility of Chinese peasants are protected. Yes, they do not get permanent residence in the city, so which means that they were not entitled to some of the social welfare, housing, education. But the fact is, remember, there are now 200 million migrant workers in China, and there are a lot more. If you go to Chinese village today, basically you do not see people above 16 years old or below like 35 or even 40, because those people, the labor force, already moved to the cities. So this, I think, is the most important policy, probably in history, in human history. Within a very short period of time, lifted so many people out of absolute poverty. And then, not just this policy of mobility, but also there's a policy that the Chinese peasants, they continue to keep their land. The farmland for Chinese peasants are the social security. Which means that if they lose job in the cities, they go back to their village. They still have a piece of land. Not just that, the village becomes, the backyard. almost in the battlefield. I mean, the city is the battlefield. Basically, young people come to city, earn money, and then when they get married, they cannot afford to raise their kids in the city, and then they send them back to the villages. And those kids, when they grow up, they do not get good education, so they probably become migrant worker again. So this is the probably potential crisis, in the future, because this is what I call it, like in Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong know, this is the Filipino-made trap. You come to city, earn money, and then you go back to raise your, your family actually is in the villages. But I have to say that if you read newspaper, they're talking about this migrant worker, how bad conditions they are. Remember, they actually have social security. The reason they come to the city, work in the factories, is because they think this is better. This is not just better in terms of the income compared to the income from the farming, but also it is an educational process. When we interview these workers, they like to come to the cities because city is the life. They learn a lot. If you go to Chinese cities, you see a lot of restaurants, massage, haircut, all this salon, Those are the places which this migrant worker, their first job. The first job allow them to stay in the cities, and then they learn a lot about the city. And also, if you think about the Chinese city, especially Beijing, Shanghai, these places, these are the cities with the best infrastructure. And if you go to any of these cities, the subway, the minute they complete, it's full, it's over capacity, beyond over capacity. And you see the people using the subways, the buses, most of them are migrant workers. Shanghai, more than half of the population in Shanghai is coming from outside of Shanghai. The city we are studying in Foshan, next to Guangzhou, 50% of the population is from outside. So this, I think this the urbanization, the industrialization, which is started, from the export processing, industry, in Guangdong, which leads to inequality, but also, I think if you look at it dynamically, actually this is opportunity to for the future for the Chinese peasants, and then the East Coast was opened, and the West Coast was extremely poor, 10 years, 20 years ago. But now, for the last 10 years, the West has higher growth rate than the East. Why? Because 15 years ago, the Chinese government initiated a strategy which is called Go West, basically trying to develop the West. And that time, huge infrastructure project was started. I was in Chongqing, many years ago. They built wonderful, highway, no traffic. But today, it's full because they built the old, they basically restarted the Silk Road, the western part. So, so in the sense that a lot of these infrastructure projects allows the mobility of people and also mobility of capital and a lot of things. In China today, a migrant worker, a person, even as peasants, they in the villages, they have mobile phone. If they are friends in East or in any big cities, no opening, a job opening, they make a phone call, within 24 hours, people can actually go to the cities, take bus, overnight bus, So this is, I think, the mechanisms behind why China, you go to China, you actually see people, most people are quite happy. And you go to big cities, you don't see a lot of police. Even the migrant workers, they live in different parts of the city, the so-called ghettos, in the West, right? But in a way, it's quite, the conditions usually have to be better than in their villages. Otherwise, they will go back home. So that's why you don't see a lot of homeless in Chinese cities. And then I will come back to this, the housing. One of the biggest reform in China, last 10 years was the privatization of housing. Almost more than 90% of households own their own house. So the ratio is extremely high. Why? Because under Zhu Rongji, Premier Zhu Rongji, he initiated a program basically privatizing all the worker-occupied housing, which was built by the state-owned company, and also the government employee, occupied housing. So a program was initiated to basically privatize all of them, and that is the foundation for the booming housing market in China. And that was a huge transfer of wealth to the urban resident. But at the same time, the commercial residential housing market also developed very rapidly. And they started with luxury housing. And that leads to this huge increase, in price in Beijing, Shanghai, And one of the problems here is that the housing are financed by mortgage. And people who have to pay 30 to 40% down payment. And those are only those rich people or people from overseas, like from Hong Kong, Taiwan, or expatriated, they can afford to buy those luxury housing. And the interest rate is only about 5–6%. And those housing, the price are increasing 30% a year. So within the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of people get rich through this market. And just a few weeks ago, because the government in the last 5 years have trying to resolve this problem. It creates a huge social problem because the amount of wealth created is just so huge, the contrast is so big. So that's behind the reason the Chinese government imposed a very harsh administrative control. Basically control price, control quantity, and basically does not allow, Beijing does not allow foreigners or residents outside of Beijing to buy housing, and if you are single, you can only buy one. If you are married, you can buy two. So these measures, I think, is just like the traffic, the cars in Beijing. In Beijing, if you go to Beijing, you want to buy a car, you have to join a lottery. So this is a very harsh control on, if you look from economics point of view, this is ridiculous. This is price control. But behind it is the social issue. If these measures are not adopted, there may be more serious consequences. So what's the time? Maybe I stop here. Okay, if you have time, I will say that the last one is really the state-owned and the private-owned. The state-owned company in China, yes, among the 500 biggest companies, more than 80–90% of asset profit, are from the state-owned companies. So what happened in China during the last 30 years is that the smaller state-owned companies has been all privatized. Because the government, when they see loss-making companies, they say this is a liability. You have problem with worker, you have problem with the debt, right? So they say, okay, why don't the local government take care? And then the local government basically get rid of them. And it happens that all the state-owned companies existing today, they are either in the monopolized sector, or in some strategical sector. They're all making huge profit. So that's really a problem. It even affected China's saving. The amount of consumption in household consumption as a ratio of GDP has been very, very low. Largely because a huge amount of profit and the wealth has been kept in the state-owned companies. And they actually start to invest in housing, market. This is most profitable sector. So that's a huge problem. And then the way to solve the problem, the government is trying to find a way to solve the problem. And I was in Beijing, in the China Development Forum, and the Minister of Finance, Lou Jiwei, basically he said that there's three ways dealing with this inequality, three models. One model is 30 years ago, everybody is equal, but we don't produce anything, productivity is very low. The other model is that basically European, maybe the Western model, government spend a lot on social welfare, and then you have huge deficit and huge debt. And then basically what left is the middle way, which Lou Jiwei says he's going to pursue. It's basically you cannot basically pay for lazy people. You have to, before you spend on social welfare, you have to look at your budget. So if you look at the Chinese government budget, it's actually quite conservative. And I think in the way, the state-owned companies, the huge assets, actually could become a buffer for some of the social welfare reforms, which in health, in education, in pension, the huge challenges, in China compared to the West. But I think so far, the very pragmatic approach in China so far has been quite successful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for providing very interesting examples, which of course relate to China, but may have broader implications. Now, John, you have the floor, and I guess a slide.
Thank you so much, and thanks to the organizers. I'd like to start, if I could, poll the room. And we have this topic of inequality, but I'd love to just get a sense, if I could, of everyone in the room. And I'm going to ask you to vote with your hands. I want to ask you one simple question. How concerned are you about global inequality? If you're extremely concerned, 10 out of 10. If you think it's the most pressing challenge in the world. If you're not at all concerned, maybe a 0 fingers. And if you're somewhere in between, a 5. So I'm just curious, by show of hands, everyone in the room, if you were to self-assess how concerned you are about global inequality, how would you rate yourself? So you see a 5, 10, a lot of 10s actually, a lot of high numbers. Any 0s, 1s, or 2s? Like 1, okay. So we do have a broad range of views, but we have, I would say, a sentiment that this is a major issue. That actually mirrors my own experience working in the international system, where I would say this is almost the zeitgeist of the global conversation right now. There's an incredible concern about global inequality. And today I want to talk about what I would call the lines and the minds. We're at the Institute for New Economic Thinking's major event in the hub, if you will, of the global economic transformation. And I really want to not just talk about the economics, but also the thinking. Because I think that we in the economics profession have to rethink how we think about some of these most pressing global issues. How much we are concerned about economics is probably, or about inequality, pardon me, is not just a factor of our views, it's probably also a factor of where we live. This is a graph, not a surprising one, of basically the switch from divergence to global convergence in per capita incomes by region. So you see, since around the turn of the last decade or the beginning of the millennium, we've seen even sub-Saharan Africa start to converge in global incomes. These are multiples of North American income among different regions. So in a certain sense, one might ask, well, if global inequality is decreasing at a regional level, why are we also concerned about it? This is Branko Milanovic's recent work, which I highly recommend to anyone who hasn't had a chance to see it. This is income growth across the global income distribution. So the horizontal axis, sorry it's small, is where you are in the percentile of the global income distribution. And then the vertical axis is actual growth over a 20-year period, roughly 1988 to 2008. And this is the so-called reclining S-curve, where you see if one's looking at what you could simply call China's middle class, there's an incredible growth of incomes. If you're part of the United States middle class, which is that trough near the right, there's not much change in income at all. And there's a sense of disconnect. If you're in the lowest part of the global income distribution on the far left bottom corner, it still doesn't feel so good. And this, of course, has a lot of measurement bias in it because the poorest people aren't even captured in this. So as much as we've seen incredible progress in global inequality, it's obviously a very different story for different people in the world. But this is also one of my favorite graphs. This is mapping where you are on your national distribution and how that links to the global distribution. And that red line is basically the 5th percentile of the United States. And you see that even the poorest of the United States are wealthier than almost all of India, for example. This is as of 2010. You see that China, if you were to look across time, is actually shifting upward and to the left. It intersected that point just 5 years before, that red dotted line a little further over. And you see Brazil, kind of spectacularly, almost represents itself the global income distribution. It mirrors the inequalities of the world in just one country. But how you feel about your income matters tremendously. I'm Canadian, but I live in the United States, and I would say that there's an epochal change in the conversation around inequality within the United States. In terms of people, thanks of course to the work of Stephen and many others, in terms of understanding how disconnected the society has become. But I do believe as an economist that we need to look at much more than incomes. I think if we're looking at issues of inequality, whether they're normative or objective or subjective, the deepest questions aren't just how we're doing in material terms, but they're whether we even get a chance, literally, to live. And my own view of the bottom line of extreme poverty, for example, is whether your child lives or not. Does your child make it to their 5th birthday? I think this is the absolute ultimate bottom line measure of humanity. Do we care for our own children, and do we care for the world's children? And this is quite interesting because this is, again, multipliers of the North American child mortality rate. And you see that Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, Latin America have all seen tremendous progress, but this is actually a much more recent phenomenon than the global convergence in incomes. Sub-Saharan Africa matches, but you see South Asia, in particular, and East Asia, are quite different than the income graphs. And even if we look just at China and India, which are, of course, drivers quantitatively of so much of what's happening in the world, there's been a transformation in just those two countries in the past 15 years. We had flat lines of disparity and even divergence with India right up to the end of the last century. But we're now in the middle of a global convergence in health standards too. We have a long ways to go. India's child mortality rate is still 8 times North America's. Africa's is roughly twice that again. But the long-term structural shift is phenomenal. Now, why did that happen? Why is this child mortality path quite distinct from the income path? What role did economists play in this? This is the minds part. I would conjecture, hypothesize, or even strongly argue that perhaps the deepest structural change on the planet in the past 15 years has been the approach to global health. This has gone from a roughly non-existent system, which had some great successes, such as the eradication of smallpox in 1977 as a generational effort, but then really not much. Beyond a few small issues here and there, Jim Grant, when he was head of UNICEF, led a revolution in immunizations. But the economists were not part of this conversation. And actually, on most of the issues here, and I'm generalizing, so forgive me, the economists played very little role. And in my view, that's a mismatch. Because here we have one of the richest pools of talent in the world. I'm an economist too, so I like to think we have things to offer. But we have one of the most profound challenges of humanity, and we have very little interaction between. And what grounds do I have for saying that? It's a strong claim. I had the privilege of working a lot on the Millennium Development Goals. These are the global anti-poverty targets, anti-extreme poverty targets set by the largest gathering of world leaders in history. This is them at the Millennium Summit in September 2000. You might recognize a few faces there. But I found in my experience it took a long time for this global agreement. And I'm curious, how many people in the room feel that they could list all 8 Millennium Development Goals if they were cornered in a dark room? Not many. A, because it's technical, it's complicated. B, it's a UN thing over there. Economists don't do diplomacy so much. We do G8, we do G20. We do the World Bank and IMF. But one of the things I noticed was that this idea really spread, these Millennium Goals. This is Davos, front stage, January 2008. It took a while, but you had world leaders. You have Ban Ki-moon, you have President Yar'Adua, then President of Nigeria, Gordon Brown, then Prime Minister, Queen Rania, Bill Gates, Bono. You have Peter Piot, the head of UNAIDS, in the background. There was a global call to action several years after these goals were set. At the same time, you had in 2005, we now know in 2006, the largest public outpouring in history of global attention around extreme poverty. We had perhaps the world's most respected politician, Nelson Mandela, saying this was his recommendation for the once-in-a-generation goal to take on. And so we had this growing set of mindsets, but it didn't extend to the research community of economics. This is a graph of the World Bank's policy research papers and the percentage of their papers over the past decade that referenced the Millennium Development Goals. This is the world's leading repository of economists and development economists focused on these issues. And in no year since these goals were set did more than 4% of their research papers even mention these global goals. I consider that a disconnect. Given that when you went into the World Bank in the lobby, every banner at 1818 H Street was Millennium Development Goals. The research community wasn't there. But I don't actually blame the World Bank, and I know Jim Kim, who I think of so highly, is really taking this on. But I think it comes back to the economics community. Because those World Bank researchers, many of whom are academic in the pure sense, they take their cue from the journals. And this is back to INET's core mission. This is a list of mentions, not in percentage terms, but in absolute terms, of journals that mentioned in any form, whether a footnote or a text, the Millennium Development Goals. That's the blue is AER, Journal of Political Economy, and QJE, Quarterly Journal of Economics. And the green is the field specialty journal, the Journal of Development Economics. Journal of Development Economics had its first single article that referenced the goals in 2007. And there's been roughly 24 articles in the elite journals that even mention these goals over the past decade. Again, I call that a disconnect. Now, many people will say, well, that's because it's an academic question versus a policy question. That's actually not true. Final graph I want to show is the world's leading health journal, The Lancet. The red is the number of health-related articles, research and review. There's actually more than 1,000 if you include everything in The Lancet, but this is just per year, the major substance articles. And you see that there's an order of magnitude difference in how the academic health community has focused on these issues compared to how the academic economics community is focused on these issues. I don't consider this a differentiation of ability, I consider it a differentiation of focus. And in my view, that's why we can understand, or it's crucial to helping understand, why the global health field has had a revolution, unlike the global development economics field has seen in the past decade. So this matters if we go back to Robert Johnson's opening comment, where he was talking about sustainability on the opening session of the conference, and sustainable development is perhaps the greatest challenge of economics and our time, and global sustainability. I actually agree with that. I think conceptually the problems are the most difficult. Technically, there's the most unresolved sets of issues. Politically, the questions of cost and burden sharing are enormous. And academically, we have to shift our objective function from how to do better to how to solve the problems. That's a big shift for economists. Ultimately, doctors and physicians are trained to think through how to save a patient's life. Ultimately, economists are trained how to make the best use of the next dollar. I think if we want to take on these issues of global inequality, if we want to take on these issues of global development, if we want to take on these issues of sustainability in a serious way, we have to make sure that those graphs look very different in the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John, for that wake-up call. I think it's very appropriate. Now, Sanjay, you have the floor.
Good morning. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you. I am very grateful for the opportunity in many different respects, but I think most fundamentally it's because INET has played a unique role in attempting to broaden the discussion in economics. And I think it's very clear that many of the kinds of people who are assembled here today would not have met one another in a single room were it not for INET. I contrast the kind of discussion which is happening here today and which has been happening at other INET conferences with the nature of the discussion which took place in economics for the, let us say, 20 years preceding the crash of 2008. And many of us, most of us perhaps, recall that period when in many ways the discussion was rather constricted. And I think not only of the very important question of the relationship between finance and the real economy, and what are the appropriate regulatory and supervisory safeguards which ought to apply to finance, which has been such an important part of the discussion in INET conferences, but also about other issues. For example, concerning the nature and impact of globalization, which is really going to be my topic today. The title of our panel is concerns the fact of, and presumably the fact of rising inequality within China, India, and the United States. And of course, as Branko Milanovic has shown in his recent work, or very, very carefully documented in his recent work, this is also something which has taken place in many other countries around the world. In my view, the role of globalization in understanding a number of the phenomena that ought to concern us, not just the increases in inequality within countries, but also the diverging pattern of income growth in the world, the slowdown of growth in the previously considered developed countries, the high-income countries, the increasing solidity and rapidity of growth in the middle-income countries, especially the large, fast-growing middle-income countries, and other factors and phenomena, including financialization, which also bears a relationship to globalization, cannot be understood without reference to it. And yet, the economics profession, for the most part, paid very little heed to globalization as the key to understanding all of these disparate phenomena, and even today it is struggling to find a single key with which to understand them. I think back, for instance, to the discussion on inequality within the United States, which took place beginning in earnest in the early 1990s, where there was a rather narrow focus on increases in the wage disparities between skilled and unskilled workers, and between, for example, college graduates and those who are not qualified with college degrees. This was not a discussion about increases in income inequality generally, which is an issue which has been much more at the core of the discussion since 2008. It was a rather limited discussion, and that was the discussion which was taking place within the economics profession. And even that limited discussion which was taking place was happening in a very limited way. Many of you may recall that the emphasis in that discussion was on the role of something called skill-biased technological change, which was a kind of deus ex machina, which was pulled out to explain what it was thought that other factors could not explain. But the role of globalization had not been properly attended to in understanding growing income inequalities in the United States and elsewhere. And this is, of course, not to say that globalization was all important, but simply to say that it seemed that in many respects, the relevance of globalization as a causal factor had been ruled out of court from the beginning because of the zeal of the economists, at least those economists who had the largest bullhorns, to show that globalization could only be a good thing and could only bring about positive effects. I think that one of the lasting consequences of the constriction of the debate has been that we are still trying to find a way to discuss globalization in a more subtle fashion, even as the imperative has fallen away to argue that globalization is either a good or a bad, with the economists of the day insisting that it could not be anything other than a good, meaning for them an unmitigated good, which could not therefore be responsible for growing inequalities or indeed any other adverse phenomenon. I believe it was George Stigler who referred to economists as yes men in the halls of political economy, and this afternoon we have a panel on economics and power, which includes as its subtitle the phrase faulty advice. And it seems to me that the issue here is very much not one of whether globalization is a good or is a bad. That, in fact, would be a rather simple-minded question, but that of whether we can understand its role as an ambiguous and complex phenomenon, which therefore demands the tailoring of policy advice in light of that complexity. Beyond the narrowness of the discussion of globalization in terms of its focus, there was, of course, also the narrowness of the theoretical apparatus which was employed to understand it. The role of the workhorse 2x2x2 model of Heckscher, Ohlin, Vanek, and Samuelson is known by all of you in this debate. It presents a stylized representation of the world as consisting of two countries, each producing two commodities and two factors of production, very often thought of as capital and as labor. And this is obviously much too narrow an understanding of the nature of the world. But on the basis of that workhorse model, it was concluded that, if anything, globalization should bring about a reduction in inequalities in the labor-abundant poor countries, and the conclusion of the model that it would bring about an increase in inequalities, at least between capital and labor in the rich countries, tended to be soft-pedaled. And indeed, there were a number of somersaults done by distinguished economists who wanted to argue simultaneously that trade was a factor in economic growth and that it could not possibly be responsible for the measured increases in inequality in rich countries, in particular between skilled and unskilled workers, because the nature and quantity of the observed trade volumes between North and South could not possibly account for them. I would like to suggest to you that a minimally realistic model of the world economy, even in terms of the Heckscher-Ohlin, Vanek-Samuelson framework, would consist of 3 countries, 3 commodities, and 3 factors of production. And the 3 countries we might think of as the rich countries, the middle-income countries, and the low-income countries. We might think of 3 factors of production involving capital, labor, and land. And 3 commodities can be thought of in various possible ways. But even that minimal increase in complexity, as many of you will know who have entered into the rarefied realm of trade theory at all, leads to rather more ambiguous conclusions than can be derived in the simplest possible framework. Indeed, it becomes difficult even to define concepts such as factor intensity in such a context, as many of you will be well aware of. So what is a more relevant and appropriate framework for understanding the impact of globalization? Well, I would start, and I think many of us would start, with Arthur Lewis, who I understand was also mentioned here the other day. Recently, I was on a panel which celebrated the publication of Chrystia Freeland's recent book called Plutocrats. And in response to her, I wrote a brief piece, which I'll be happy to circulate to you, called Where Do Plutocrats Come From? And I would suggest that the way that we should think about where plutocrats come from, and where plutocrats have come from in particular in recent years, has very much to do with the impact of a Lewisian framework of analysis for understanding globalization. At any rate, I would put the Lewisian framework at the center and then add some additional explanatory factors to it. Now, Lewis, as you know, thought of the world as being centrally characterized by a South which contained within it what he called unlimited supplies of labor, which were available in principle at relatively constant wages, which would not be expected to have to rise in the short run in order to absorb that labor into manufacturing sector activity or modern sector activity generally. Now, Lewis, of course, like the first generation of development economists, was an export pessimist, like the rest of the first generation. He didn't appreciate the role that exports would have in national development, and now we see that that role is all important. In recent years in China, as you know, there has been a very vibrant discussion about the possibility that this Lewisian condition has finally ended. But the rapid wage rises which have been experienced in China, in particular in coastal China, in the last 7 to 10 years, are still a relatively recent phenomenon. And if we want to understand the large arc of Chinese development, a Lewisian labor supply framework would still have to be very much at the center. One of the very interesting observations which Lewis made in his initial article, which is not generally paid sufficient attention to, is that one of the consequences of the stagnation of wages due to its abundance at a rather fixed wage, or a relatively fixed wage, would be an increase in the profit share in national income over time. And I would like to argue that one of the things that we have seen in the world economy as a whole is that as the Lewisian unlimited supply of labor has become effectively available on a world scale for the first time, in part due to technological innovations which have made it so, such as those in communications and transportation, which since the mid-1970s have made it for the first time possible to bring effectively on tap these global supplies of labor, especially from those parts of the world, such as China, which have made active efforts to make that labor effectively exploitable, has been that we have seen this phenomenon in the world as a whole, of an increase in profits which is associated with the possibility of effectively drawing upon those those supplies of labor at relatively low wage costs. Now, in addition to this rather conventionally Lewisian dimension, one might add the aspect of threat effects, which have only recently come to be appreciated by economists. When it becomes possible to outsource production either through trade or through capital flows and integration of production in global production chains, which have become increasingly complex and diversified, then of course the possibility arises that one may increase the bargaining power of capital and diminish the bargaining power of labor, causing a bidding down of bargained wages in countries where bargained wages had previously been high. And this is a phenomenon which, by and large, the economists in the mainstream ignored. As I mentioned, the discussion was almost entirely confined to the standard framework in which wage determination happens only through shifts in the marginal revenue products of different factors of production. Whereas in a framework which takes threat effects seriously, there may be observable and significant effects on bargained wages which are not directly attributable to such changes in marginal revenue products. And indeed, there need not be any actual trade or capital flow which takes place, or change in the pattern of trade or capital flows which takes place for threat effects to be consequential, which is why we can give them that name. So this is another phenomenon which I think we have only begun to be more awake to, and which the economics literature has begun to recognize, but which has played a significant role, especially in the median wage stagnation which is observed in the United States, and more generally in the deterioration of working class incomes in developed countries. The story wouldn't be complete, however, without also recognizing the role of globalization in creating demands on an unprecedented scale for certain kinds of goods and services, and the effect which this has in turn upon the incomes of those persons and entities which provide those services. One can think, for instance, about the phenomenon of resource-rich countries and individuals who control resources within those countries who have generated enormous wealth as a consequence. Russia is a case in point. India is also an interesting case. If one looks at the recently created billionaires in India, a certain number of them are associated with high tech, biotechnology, information technology, and so on. But a fair number of them are also associated with command over land, in the sense that the classical political economists would have understood the term inclusively, not just to mean land on which one builds buildings, but of course, minerals, natural resources of various kinds. And of course, the nexus with the state and criminality in a number of countries, including the two countries that I've mentioned, which is involved in establishing control or effective command over such resources, is very substantial. I think very few of us would have anticipated that India would have shown up as a land-abundant country on the world scale. But this appears to be exactly what has, in a sense, happened with some of these Indian billionaires exporting minerals from India to enter into manufactured goods production in China and elsewhere. And of course, this in part has to do with the artificiality of the low prices which are perceived. There is a considerable difference between social cost and private cost in this instance and in other such instances. Less obviously, we may think of cases such as the fortunes associated with Facebook or other such IT-enabled networked services to be also connected to globalization, because we know that the scale of networks matters crucially in determining what is the revenue to be had from them. And here, the United States has done better than in other domains in capturing a large share of the rents which are to be possessed from such globalized networks. Sorry, I didn't even see that. So since I have no more time, let me stop there. But suffice it to say that there's much more to say, and in particular, there's a great deal to say, which I will leave to the discussion about the following question, which is that of what are the implications of this kind of an alternate view for understanding not merely the etiology or the causes of inequalities, but the way in which particular policies which are attuned toward diminishing inequalities in this causal context can also address simultaneously many of the other dilemmas we have. And I would just like to throw out as a teaser, without following up on this now, that there is a very clear-cut connection between the particular macroeconomic problems which exist in all three countries, in China, India, and the United States, and the growing inequalities which have emerged in all three countries, which have emerged in this particular causal matrix. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sanjay. I think you agree with me that this has been an extremely rich panel. We have been looking at so many issues ranging from social mobility in the United States, different drivers of inequality in China, the interaction between health and economics, which needs a wake-up, and of course this very impressive effort in reviewing economic theory and globalization in 16 minutes. But that leads me to one very obvious and perhaps naive conclusion, that it is impossible to leave out the inequality dimension from both analysis and policy prescriptions, more and more so. And I think this very simple result, if you agree with me, would be an important one that INET should be credited with. So now I'd like to open the floor, and then we go back to our panelists. Yes, that gentleman over there. Can we have microphones? Thanks.
Sony Kapoor, I run the think tank Redefine. Three quick questions that would be great to have the panel's response to. The first is the phenomenon now that because of scalability and mobility of the rise of plutocrats and billionaires in otherwise poor economies, and the fact that this class of people feels kindred spirit with other billionaires from developed economies, is it going to fundamentally change the dynamics we've seen in history? Historically, for one reason or the other, because they didn't want to get the guillotine, or because they were genuinely philanthropic, or because of Henry Ford and his ilk, they saw economic value. There has been a much stronger link between societies that generated billionaires and what the billionaires give back to society. And that link now seems to be weaker than ever before. Will this affect the dynamics of inequality? Second quick question, to what extent is the fact that all of us are taxpayers, consumers, workers, voters, and when we vote, when we take decisions, what we may want to choose as consumers, for example, Walmart, might at an aggregate level hurt us as workers, as an example. So to what extent is this complexity contributing to the dynamics of inequality? And the last point, to what extent is the fact that there's an ever-increasing differential between where value is actually created and where value is actually captured, be it at a cross-border level or within countries? To what extent is that a driver of inequality?
Thank you. Gentleman over here, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for the extremely informative array of perspectives on the question of inequality and around the world. I'd like to refer to the China's development model. In fact, the model also to a large extent in India and Brazil, to the extent that that a certain degree or a greater degree of inequality is necessary to build the kind of groundwork and the infrastructure or the capacity in order for the country, the relevant country, to attain eventual a greater degree of equality. Now, China is a typical example. Our Chinese, the expert panel speaker was referring to Deng Xiaoping's dictum of letting a few people get rich first. But now you look at the inner provinces, according to the latest study by the Economic Intelligence Unit, which was out only about 2 weeks ago, all these backward cities in the provinces, they're registering double-digit growth. So now eventually the country is becoming more equal than before. But in order to build the capacity, it seems that large developing countries need to have a greater degree of inequality in order to conserve the kind of resources to build the necessary capacity to attain greater equality in the end. I don't know whether the panel would agree with that proposition.
Thank you. The lady over there.
My question is actually, since yesterday we heard that institution matters, and today we're talking about globalization and the impact on inequality. Before we actually start to talk about globalization's negative impact, shouldn't we look at whether domestic institutions or the bad parts of institution or good part is amplified by globalization, rather than say that itself is leading to problems. The reason I say that is in China, inequality has risen dramatically over the last 15, 20 years. But at the same time, there has been a lot of domestic policy, deliberate perhaps, but also having negative consequences. For example, extreme fiscal decentralization, very regressive tax system, unequal access to public services, especially the 2/3 of the rural population have no equal access to basic public services, for example, clean water and basic education and healthcare. And also the access to product market. Farmers sell their land, cannot get equal paid as to local governments or urban residents. And also unequal access to capital and land, all the productive resources. Those are the parts, in our view, that, that's not a new economic thinking, obviously, but those are the main factors that probably drive into inequality that are amplified by globalization. So my question is that, is it really globalization, or is it the institutions in the domestic situation?
Thank you. A couple of more questions before I give the floor back. Lady over there.
Since what we're seeing, sorry, Robin Meredith, author of The Elephant and the Dragon, as Xiao points out, in China, we've seen massive inequality, but that's because everyone's no longer a peasant in the last 30 years. That's a good thing. How big is the risk, if we look back at historical precedent, that we'll get a pushback from the rich countries who are seeing their incomes actually erode? Because it strikes me as a good thing that the incomes are rising and even health outcomes improving in poor countries.
Final point, then you stop there, please.
Thank you. Peter Jung. What puzzles me is we have a debate about inequality in China or in India since these countries have become richer than they were ever before. We never had a debate about inequality 30 years ago about China or India. So why are we concerned now about this? And my question relates to that. There's a very ugly word in the West, and that is Manchester capitalism. We know what Charles Dickens was referring to, that the people came from the rural sector, exactly like we see this in China now, and were living under very bad conditions in cities. But they were certainly better off than if they would have stayed on back home. And is it not a similar situation that this transition sort of is needed to come finally to a better living conditions for them and then for that society?
Okay, final question, and I apologize to the others that we don't have time to take all the questions.
I want to talk about income distribution in the United States. 60 years ago, I did a PhD thesis on this question, and one of the things that interests me is the wage share in gross national product for about 50 years in the United States was roughly constant at about 2/3, except for the Great Depression. Since the 1970s, the wage share has gone down. The other point was when I became an assistant professor at an elite Ivy League school in the 1950s, there was a study by a man named Herman P. Miller on income distribution of American people, which showed that the average income of a plumber was higher than the average income of a professor at an Ivy League school. Now, those blue-collar jobs were paying more wages than these elite jobs. CEOs of the relationship between the CEO salary and the average worker salary was much smaller than it is today. What explains that? Let me throw an example. The labor union movement, which kept blue-collar wages high relative to what we would call elite professions, and particularly, and this may, a man named Walter Reuther, who was the head of the union auto workers, who was a very important political player in making sure that wages stayed high. And since Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Thatcher, the labor union movement has disappeared practically. And is that part of an explanation of the higher income inequality in the United States?
Thank you. Now I'll give my friends here 2 minutes each to respond to all the questions. But you pick which ones you're... Can we start with you, Steve?
Well, only a few were about the United States, so let me somehow aggregate them. I think there are 2 points. One of them had to do with the issue of thinking about disadvantage versus pure inequality, and that was the question about the remarkable growth in China. And that was and that's part of what needs to be done in terms of formulating models of the evolution of the distribution of income, both cross-sectionally and intertemporally. Obviously, if I have a circumstance where everybody is doing better, but there are increasing differentials, that would be the Rawlsian case that justifies inequality. In contrast, the worries, particularly in the United States, are that there's a diminution of living standards for some Americans and opportunities are diminishing. But I think the distinction that was brought up does indicate why equality of opportunity per se is not the only objective, and we have to think through carefully, the distinction between disadvantage and inequality. The second comment has to do with political economy, and that is, I interpreted a number of the remarks as asking whether or not inequality itself can create forces that would exacerbate it, and that is certainly the case. A straightforward example would be the allocation of political power associated with increasing inequality. The second, which is, I'll say, specific to the American case, is what I'm going to refer to as, or actually was referred to as the increasing disconnectedness of a society, and that is that the social relationships, the role of public institutions such as schools versus private schools, et cetera, those all emerge through choices individuals make. And so one of the phenomena that inequality can do is generate increasing stratification of communities and schools, increasing segregation of communities and schools, and that is what represents, in its extreme form, a poverty trap. The final comment, which Paul Davidson brought up, had to do in terms of wages. There's certainly a plethora of issues in understanding increasing wage inequality. He is right that one issue point that has emerged is that wage shares have decreased, and I think Sanjay brought up a very interesting point in terms of understanding of that in the context of globalization. Second, the strength of unions, and I'll say the social norms associated with inequality, I think can plausibly be said to have changed. Now, at this point, I don't know how to identify the quantitative roles of these things, and that's part of why this is a multi-year project, is working out a high-dimensional problem, and that then leads to this very deep empirical question, which is how do you assign relative salience? And so I think those should be on the table, but it's going to take a few years before I feel I can say much more.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Xiao.
very good questions and comments. I would just have a few points. I think we are probably at the best time in history. If you look at the bottom 20% of people around the world, how they become urban residents, the urbanization, So the Chinese experience, I think it's, Michael Spencer yesterday, the beginning of the conference mentioned that China is a systemically important country. And the Chinese model, I think, is extremely important because the Chinese model now looks more like it's the city. The cities actually creates all those institutions, so allow the workers to find the jobs. It's the jobs which leads to the reduction of inequality. And I think in the future, this is what Dwight Perkins told me 10 years ago, when I was with him in the western part of China, and he says that don't worry. He said American experience shows that the western part of the world grow, inequality will appear, but later, they will reduce. And that's exactly what happened today. So the rich country, I think that's a very good question. There's a lot of worry about the Chinese taking away jobs from rich country. But this is changing. I think the purchasing power, which is already created in China, is going to create huge opportunities for the West. And it's just a matter of time. Just think about the infrastructure. How many airports China has built during the last 10 years? And if the Chinese people start traveling within China, they also want to go to New York. But all the airports in New York are prepared for the OECD country people. So that means that there's huge potential once the Chinese, Indian, African, they start to, move around. So mobility is going to create convergency. And so I'm very optimistic here.
Thanks. John? We're already beyond time limits.
Yeah, I'll just say very quickly, on this point of globalization, I think certainly the forces of globalization are deep and beyond any particular institution. At the same time, I think the role of institutions is to manage these forces in ways that fit with social contracts. Ultimately, the goal, in my view, is increasingly what does a global social contract look like? And just to clarify, I talked a lot about health, not as a narrow objective, but as a broader question of if we can't look at first order issues of survival, which is uncontrovertible as important, what are we doing looking at these other local optimum questions in the meantime? And so I think we have to be thinking much more broadly about how to design and finance these institutions, and the plutocrats, many of whom have supported my own work over the years, I'm grateful for. But I think the deep question is not whether they're affecting history, they certainly are. The deep question is what's their role in contributing to others' history. And we do have things like the Giving Pledge taking shape, giving away half their wealth and so forth. But the biggest question is a lot of those people are lucky. And how do they share that with others? And I don't feel like we have a global set of norms to manage that yet, and that's a need for an institution, at least in an implicit sense.
Thank you. Sanjay, you have the last word.
Thank you. Since we're over time, I'll just confine myself to addressing one question, though I think a number of important questions were raised, which I hope to take up individually later. But just to say that I want to be very clear that my suggestion was absolutely not that we should be against globalization, but precisely that we should think about the complementarities and the connections between appropriate domestic policies and the taking advantage of opportunities provided by a global market economy. And I think China's experience is extremely instructive in this regard, that the reason that China gained decisive advantages over other low-income countries when it was a lower-income country, and continues to have them today, even as its wages have risen considerably, is that there are a whole range of complementary investments, including infrastructural investments, which provide decisive unit cost advantages to Chinese manufacturers. And that's a consequence of a public policy. Now, as we have heard, it's moving toward the West, that Western Chinese provinces are able to take advantage of opportunities for similar reasons, that infrastructure is enabling them to do that, and that's a consequence of public policy. That's just one example. There are many examples, and I think that to try to explore the opportunities for coalescence of interest, recognizing, however, that there can be conflicts of interest, is very crucial. In the Chinese case, for example, and here I will end, one more example involving China, it's very clear to everybody that what is called rebalancing has to happen for China to address some of its potential future macroeconomic concerns. And in particular, rebalancing from more of an investment-centered to a consumption-centered strategy. How does that happen? Through increasing Chinese wages and social entitlements. And that can best happen, I would suggest, in a context in which there's coordination between China and other countries in doing so. And I think that that can only also be to the benefit of countries such as the United States for the reason that Xiao mentioned and other reasons. But it will not solve the fundamental problem for the North that the South as a whole offers competition of a kind that is not easily avoided. So I think that we should be open-eyed about all of the considerations which are involved.
Thanks very much. Join me in thanking our panelists.